Now, more stories, insights, and analysis of Illinois policy and politics. This is Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Once again, your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with John Tillman, President and CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute. And John, we touched on it a little bit earlier in the show. President Obama's speech in Springfield to the General Assembly on Wednesday. And we get into one specific policy proposal he offered up, consistent with the idea of the new tone of politics, more civil, areas of compromise, bipartisanship, all the stuff that he says but doesn't really believe, at least not in terms of translating into action. But one of those items was redistricting reform. That's what he focused on. Districts don't need to look like earmuffs, right? Picking your constituencies rather than having constituencies pick their representatives and so forth. More competitive elections that would lead to more participation. These are the president's words. Well, let's listen to what he said.
Second step towards a better politics is rethinking the way that we draw our congressional districts. And now, let me point this out. I want to point this out because this is another case of cherry picking here.
He's so clever.
This tends to be popular in states where Democrats have been drawing the lines among Republicans, and less popular among Republicans where they control drawing the lines. So nobody's. Let's be very clear. Nobody's got clean hands on this thing,
including the speaker. I'll tell you what, it was nice to see how much applause that all kinds of ruling class politicians representing gerrymandered districts could muster for redistricting reform.
There's so much lie, obfuscation, opaqueness, and just outright flimflammery in that whole riff you just played. First of all, he's trying to present himself as the higher oracle of love and let's all just get along, right? It's just so ridiculous. This has been the most divisive president by race, by gender, by generation, by your ethnic background, by party affiliation. He's the most partisan president since Harry Truman, a very partisan president, for those who might remember. I don't remember, but I read a lot.
He couldn't export the successful Illinois political culture to D.C. I mean, that was essentially what he said.
Yeah.
Illinois, there's no meanness here. But he couldn't get that done in D.C., and that's one of his few regrets.
There's two important points here. First of all, the reason he's making this case now is because Republicans control over 30 states. And so on the average, if you just handicap it, I'm going to be better off if I sort of equalize it. But the more important thing, Dan, secondly, is that the Democrats and the progressives know that every time there's some sort of reform for redistricting, in the end, they still control it. In the end, they game the system. And the Republicans and people on the right are just not competent at playing this game because the other side plays for keeps. The right does not.
And so we have a movement afoot in Illinois, the independent map movement. It's not exactly the model that I would support, more like maybe the Iowa model, where you have computers draw the line based on the criteria the Supreme Court has set forth: contiguousness, compactness, respect for local units, community boundaries, essentially, and let the computer draw them, and then have what may. You would have more competitive elections. You'd have an increased number of competitive elections. But this is something President Obama's been in public office, state, federal level for 20 years. It's an easy thing for him to do on his way out the door, to ring the bell for bipartisanship that he didn't practice and doesn't really have that much interest in practicing.
Well, I think that's exactly right. As he starts his farewell tour, he's going to be very conflicted because on the one hand, he has to make sure he has a successor that will protect his legacy, a Democrat nominee that wins. He's going to have to continue the divisive politics that he has mastered over the last 7.5, 8 years. So he's going to do that. But on the other hand, he's going to go on this tour around the country, and he's going to revert to where he was between 2004 and 2008 with his, lofty rhetoric and let's bring everybody together, and I'm the healer. It's going to be a very interesting dance he does, and whether the Republicans and people on the right in the middle fall for it.
Well, dispensing with President Obama's folderol.
Folderol. Nice.
It's a fun word, isn't it?
It is a great word.
Dispensing with that for a minute, the underlying issue of redistricting reform, it's something that Governor Rauner has promoted. He mentioned it in his State of the State address, along with term limits, in terms of kind of his political reform agenda, in addition to all the structural, budgetary, and financial reforms, regulatory reforms. So what about that? What about the independent map movement in Illinois, or some other kind of redistricting reform, were the balance of power to change in the General Assembly?
We certainly understand the interest in this. We've looked at that proposal very carefully, and we're very ambivalent about it. We think it is there. You know, one of the things you like to say, Dan, is that it's not broken; it's fixed.
Right.
This proposal has fixes in it that worry me greatly. That the political class will continue to control the process thereafter. There are highways and byways you can drive through to prevent the actual goal, which is fairness in mapping.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I mean, look, it is in part a personnel problem, but one of the things with the independent map, and I mean, it's a cultural problem, and that kind of the creative cartography of the Democrats is part of the political culture problem in Illinois. But it seems to me we focus on, we'll have more competitive elections, although you suggest there are highways and byways out of that in this proposal that's being bandied about. And it's worth noting, mostly by progressive leftists, so that should be of concern. Yeah, that should be of a concern as well. But it's also not just a personnel problem; it's also a culture problem. And so you have seen huge turnover in the General Assembly in the last decade, but that hasn't changed the political culture in Illinois, in part because you have the same leadership, but in part because of the underlying culture. And I think that's a larger conversation we have, rather than believing that redistricting reform or even term limits, or the combination of the two, is going to be some kind of panacea for all that ails Illinois.
You know, we're going to, in a few minutes, we're going to talk to Chuck DeVore from the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He points out the makeup of the legislatures matters. Do they come from the private sector, or are they activists, lawyers, and others who game the system? In Illinois, politics is a career choice, just like trading is, just like pharmaceuticals are. This is an industry that is profitable here. That's not true in some other places.
Yeah, and it's an industry, the only way it's profitable is by making every other industry unprofitable.
Right.